Hello, Sublation Media viewers and listeners and hopefully future readers. It's me again, Douglas Lane, and the interview you're about to watch with Deep State Kuba is a follow-up to yesterday's interview with Max Blumenthal. It's part of a series of interviews and conversations about anti-imperialism in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So what we're doing here is presenting four different conversations. One was with Max Blumenthal, and that was the most strongly kind of anti-imperialist, anti-West, anti-United States position. Today we have Kuba from the Deep State, representing what I think is basically the standard rules-based social democratic position. One which wants to hold on to the values that built institutions like the UN. And next week you'll see a conversation with Dennis Kramer, who is a philosophy and critical theory PhD student in Germany. He defends Zelensky and puts forward an argument that liberal bourgeois reforms are often necessary to help working class movements have the freedom in which to operate. And then for that reason, it's incumbent upon the left to support Zelensky and an independent Ukraine. And then finally, next week, there will also be a conversation with my son, Benjamin Lane, a little bit of nepotism, as we discuss Lenin's view on imperialism from his essay, Imperialism, the Highest Form of Capitalism, and examine Kautsky's view of imperialism as well. So those are the three other interviews that you can watch. I'll be putting links to every video as it goes up, and so retroactively in the descriptions of these different videos. Right now, if you look in the top right-hand corner, you should see a link to the Max Blumenthal essay, and I'll put that at the end as well on a card. And hopefully people will put all of these different interviews together in context and hopefully it will help you think through the problem of anti-imperialism and democracy.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast. Dr. Kuba, Deep State Kuba, is back on the channel as a follow-up to a conversation I had with Max Blumenthal. Max is, I would say, a good representative of the anti-imperialist left. His stance seemed to be in line with other people's stances, other parties' stances. I was watching a video earlier today from the Platypus Affiliated Society, and they are hosting a conversation with a variety of different leftists. They did, I think this was in, it might have been in Germany. No, I guess not, because it was in English. But they recently had a panel discussion, and it started off with some sort of sectarian Marxist saying, yeah, we support Putin's right to self-defense, and the Ukrainian conflict has to be understood in the context of NATO aggression. And I think that's basically Max Blumenthal's position as well. But you wanted to follow up on that and address some of the things that you saw, because you've gotten a sneak peek at that interview. And as our representative of the deep state, you get to put your position forward as well. We got to make sure we don't get out of line here. So go ahead.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I can enforce the equal time doctrine with drone power.
Right, exactly. So go ahead.
So the anti-imperialist frame is one that's very powerful in leftist circles and It has deep roots in Marxist theory. Of course, we could cite Lenin, but subsequent post-colonial, anti-colonial theorists have also built on the imperialism as the fundamental mechanism of the international order, and the need to strike against it, the need to end it for there to be any substantive progress towards socialism or towards just a more humane and egalitarian world system. And there's a great deal of truth in much of the criticism and analysis offered by anti-imperialists. My issue is not necessarily so much to counter anti-imperialism with a pro-imperialism line, but to suggest ways in which the anti-imperialist framework is incomplete. That it, because its claims are so broad and its prescriptions so radical, it can miss a great deal of nuance with very consequential effects. And I want to reintroduce some context that I think strong anti-imperialists are missing in terms of the way that they perceive the Ukraine-Russia war and the way that they look at the international order, and also the way that they understand the operations of empire internally, what happens in Washington, D.C., what happens in NATO. So with that in mind, maybe I'll start with a little thumbnail of how I understand the anti-imperialist position that was that Max Blumenthal presented so forcefully. And I would say that it comes out of a very strong identification between capitalism and imperialism, and specifically the imperial role of the United States. In the context of contemporary anti-imperialism, it's really only American imperialism that falls in the crosshairs, and you will have people taking positions such as only America can be imperialist. Only America is imperial at this moment. There's no anything else, any criticism of China or Russia and their security strategy and their international behavior that cannot be construed as anti-imperialist, because these powers are fundamentally outside of the imperial framework, which is Washington dominated. And that the primary struggle in political terms is to strike against this imperialist system, which means countering efforts at maintaining or shoring up or augmenting American hegemony internationally, undermining American security efforts, especially ones that project power far from the American heartland, in places where one could very reasonably say that the United States doesn't belong. That any move at destabilizing the imperial order by actors such as China or by Venezuela or by Cuba should be supported. And efforts that seem humanitarian or that people may instinctively sympathize with, such as supporting the Ukrainian defense against this Russian invasion, those should be resisted. That no-fly zone, no weapons to Ukraine. Certainly no NATO expansion. Certainly no security guarantees outside of, certainly no security guarantees extended to third countries. And that the international order that the U.S. sits atop of, which is not just a security-based order, but also includes things like the SWIFT international transaction system for financial transactions for settling trade, different economic agreements. One could say the World Trade Organization, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, NAFTA, other neoliberal efforts at creating international markets, and any other sort of Washington-centric international agencies, institutions, or systems. Those are an outgrowth of imperialism and should be dealt with skeptically, should be challenged, and their weakening or dismantlement would be a progressive step.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that?
These are all. This is all an accurate rendition of the anti-imperialist line, as far as I can tell. Some questions come to mind as you describe it, and actually, what comes to mind first is just sort of an observation, which is that the anti-imperialist politics, as an anti-capitalist politics, has a tendency to accept capitalist relations, at least in the short term. Like we imagine that if the capitalist world system were to hold, but the balance of power were to shift, and the United States didn't have its imperialist power position, that there would be a better outcome for majority of the world's population, that would be better for workers or better for people in developed nations. And I'm not utterly convinced that that is the case. I tend to see imperialism as a symptom of something that is coming out of capitalist relations rather than as a cause. And it does seem to me that there's a kind of a utopian vision of perfecting this system in the anti-imperialist vision. Like there's an idea that we could just hold on to the system as it is, if only it weren't for the bad U.S. state.
I'd propose a slightly different reading, which I'm not certain is the correct one, but it's one that I find useful, which is that anti-imperialists have the same kind of problem with the end of an American-centric imperial order as revolutionary Marxist-Leninists have with the overthrow of capitalism, which is, what do you do afterwards, right? What happens when you tear the old edifice down? Right. And the reality is that envisaging and creating something new is an extraordinarily challenging process, and it's difficult to even understand what the contours would be when you're still embedded within the old system. However, that said, just because oppressive structure, whether it's capitalism, whether it's imperialism, whether it's the fusion of both of them, some people on the left don't distinguish between imperialism and capitalism and just see them as different sides of the same overall phenomenon. But once it's gone, what takes its place? And there's no guarantee that the new order, the new structure that would come into being, would be directed or created or at all influenced by people of the left. And there's no guarantee that that system would not have a more brutal logic than the system that we have now. I don't mean to default to a kind of conservatism of futility, but I do consider this to be a challenge to the left to think of how you go and build that newer, better system. at least begin with some template, some outline, some initial priorities, and some mechanisms to achieve them, so that you're not flying blind and caught off guard when that change that you long for happens. Because other actors that might be much more malign, they have plans and they have been ready. For instance, we see in Ukraine that when the Maidan uprising was successfully executed, it wasn't the nice liberal Democrats that were interviewed on CNN and that promised democracy, freedom, that were empowered as much as the nationalists, the ethno-nationalist forces, even though the ethno-nationalists were then and continue to be a relatively small minority of the Ukrainian population. Similarly, in the Arab Spring, you had mass movements that overthrew entrenched despotic regimes. But again, the groups that were organized, that had plans, that had the manpower, the mobilization to fill the space vacated by the old regime, were not necessarily of the left and were not necessarily interested in creating a more progressive and egalitarian society. So you don't just have to think about how you're going to dismantle imperialism. You also have to think about how you're going to deal with the challenge of other ideological groups that have different plans running counter to your own.
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 points to what you just said that I think should be separated out. One is that we need to have some sort of vision, some sort of alternative system in mind as we move politically to transform this current imperialist world into something anti-imperialist and something that else. And then the other point is we need to have a strategy, a political strategy, in order to implement these changes and beat out people who have completely different visions, completely different motivations, who are going to be competing with us in the vacuum that opens up if there is say a spontaneous movement that topples the established order, which isn't very likely to happen in the United States, but can happen in developing nations and does happen in developing nations all the time. So what I would say is that if we don't think of ourselves as socialists for a moment, we just think of ourselves as anti-imperialists, there seems to me to be already a model in place, at least in the imagination, for how to have an order, a world order that is not imperialist. And it would be a rule-based order, run through international cooperation, through the UN, and through treaties and trade, and with very little military expenditures. We're most of the world focusing only on defensive capabilities when it comes to military, and certainly you wouldn't have anything on like nuclear weapons involved in an anti-imperialist world order. So, it seems to me that that is a very kind of middle of the road liberal vision that has lots of reasons for people. There's lots of reasons to be skeptical of that idea, but that is one that's available.
Well, it's the system that the United States and various Atlanticist organizations say we have and say they're defending.
Right.
It's not true what they say.
Right.
But the reason that they make these claims, and the reason that these claims are effective in at least mobilizing a certain amount of public support for those institutions and those programs, is that there is an appeal to that vision of the world. It's ironically the very individuals who trumpet it most, people at the Department of Defense, the State Department, people at the Atlantic Council, for instance, are the ones that have taken the legacy institutions of multilateralism and done the most damage to them, undermined them, and have led us from a world in which potentially there was an incipient rule-based order to one where really unilateralism and the untrammeled use of not just force, but deceit and propaganda and falsehood is the law. And that's a return to even a very imperfect version of that multilateral order, where international relations are embedded in institutions that can enforce rules, that can push back on countries that violate the rules of the game, the international order, where states reckon with the agreements that they've signed rather than treating them as merely expedients to achieve other objectives. That would be a great improvement over what we have now, even a very imperfect version of that order. And that's also something which is feasible given the structures that are in place, that have been weakened, have been etulated, have been undermined, certainly. But there is a United Nations, there are arms limitations treaties, there are regional and global organizations around things like industrial standards, around the postal service. Many of them operate quite well, considering, and allow us to have the type of regular international exchange, person-to-person trade, investment, information, you name it, that we do. Consider the regulation of the internet. Without that kind of rule-based system, the internet would not be operable. Of course, again, great powers attempt to undermine it for their own benefit, and the United States is certainly one of the violators. But the rules and structures of a kind of liberal international order are available to build on if there is the political will to do so. So I think that you're correct in that assessment, and it's also because it's a liberal project, it's easier to get international consensus around it. You don't have to rely on the tiny minority, tragically, of ideological leftists that can be mobilized in favor of an alternate type of regime. Instead, there's a lot of status quo actors that actually wouldn't mind returning to a greater degree of regularity, predictability in international relations that are already sitting in positions of power and influence.
So what do you think it is that undermined? I mean, you said it was these very people who espouse the rule-based system, the multilateral liberal order, the most, who've undermined it the most. But why do you think that happened? And I guess the other part of that would be, when did that really start to happen? When did the United States become a unilateral power that preferred that approach to world politics? And do you think it had to do with the rise of neoliberalism, or was it did it occur under Fordism as well? Was it simply just a matter of being such a monolithic and colossal economic power and military power after World War II that just made it inevitable, like that the United States would act in such a unilateral way, or was it something else?
Before I get to that, I want to bring up one other issue with the anti-imperialist framework, which is that by focusing very singularly on the problem of American imperialism, American military hegemony, American networks of power, the understanding of international relations tends to boil down to an American imperial order versus resistance countries, whether they be Venezuela, whether they be Cuba, whether they be Russia, China. Some people even stand North Korea as a proud bulwark of Marxist resistance.
Right.
And anything that the United States does is immediately suspect, and moves by those resistance countries are given a great deal of credence as self-defense measures.
Mm-hmm.
However, the majority of humanity doesn't live in either the American Imperial Metropole nor in the resistance countries, but exist in the dozens of states that try to navigate their way between the two. Some pulled closer to one regional power, others incorporated more strongly into the international order, the American-led, the American-based hegemonic international order.
Mm-hmm.
And those billions of lives are not a trivial afterthought. Think about the position of South Korea, or the most obvious case is Taiwan, but because it's obvious, I'm going to shelve it. But a country like Vietnam, which a good socialist country, has over 1 million of its own people, or approximately 1 million of its own people, and they have managed through great sacrifice to assert their own sovereignty and independence against first colonial France, then the United States. And they are threatened by the People's Republic of China. That is their number one security preoccupation, their number one concern. So the moves that anti-imperialists might applaud as Chinese self-defense, they might have very serious and negative consequences for Vietnamese sovereignty and Vietnamese lives. Similarly, South Korea is another example of a state that is at risk from the quote unquote anti-imperial resistance powers. There are dozens of countries within the European Union that regained a measure of self-determination only after the fall of the Soviet Union. Countries as diverse as Slovakia and Slovenia and Estonia, Albania. And those millions of people have an interest in their own peaceful development, their own national security, their own sovereignty. And it matters if they're able to work with the West on terms that are mutually beneficial, or if they're consigned to a Belarus-style permanent Russosphere. And those it's possible, and I'm anticipating that some anti-imperialists with a very strong bent and a very strong identification of global ills with the American-led order may say that, well, you don't have radical change without some sacrifices, right? There's the process of history is turbulent. Sometimes it is violent. And there are losses that some people will have to suffer in order to bring in the newer, better world. And as a Polish person, I am very familiar with that kind of logic. Indeed, when I think about the the Polish-Soviet War at the tail end of the Russian Revolution, and how Polish victory in that conflict prevented the link up of Eastern and Western Marxists, which was Lenin's original plan and might have decidedly changed the course of history. I wonder, were we the grapes that needed to be squashed in order to brew, in order to distill, to vent the wine of socialism? And how many Poles would need to be squashed like grapes for that to happen? And how would I feel about it if I was there at that moment, and I had to opt between my national independence, the survival of my nation, and the triumph of global socialism.
Mm-hmm.
But it is very difficult to make that kind of assessment, especially if you're not even in the position of potentially being a grape. The anti-imperialists typically come out of secure positions within that framework, meaning they exist either in relatively safe countries where they would be the last to flip once the historical course towards anti-imperialism had been determined.
Mm-hmm.
Or you also have people in the quote unquote resistance countries that see anti-imperialism as the ideological basis for their struggle against very real Western threats, and especially American threats that could easily take the form of violent overthrow of governments, as happened with Yanukovych, or outright invasion, as happened with Iraq. But what about the Taiwanese? What about the Estonians? What about the Ukrainians now? Are we just saying that they're the grapes? Putin can crush them because that's what needs to happen for anti-imperialism to progress. That's I think that's an
I mean, you're talking about
question.
two really different moments, and I would hope that the way that you would bridge Western Eastern Marxism and Western Eastern Marxists back then would be through a workers' movement in support of the Eastern Marxists rather than through an imperial
The Red Army.
Yeah, right. And if you're reduced to the Red Army, then there's something that seems to me to be going wrong with your revolution. Anyway, I mean, if you only have the Red Army, I mean, the Red Army is coming in support of on one side of a civil war, worker struggle. That's one thing.
Well, that's the thing. In the case of the Polish-Soviet War, you had an international workers' movement that attempted to peacefully intervene on the side of the USSR. For instance, there were arms shipments that were destined for Poland to be used against the USSR, which British working class dock workers refused to load, refused to permit onto ships for export. So there you go. That's your international socialist movement. And there's your peaceful intervention. You also had anticipatory revolutions in Bavaria, the Spartacists, and in Hungary under Bela Kun that also sought to sort of prepare the way for the East-West leftist bridge. And some Western countries, some countries in the heart of Europe, whether in this interwar period or after World War II, Greece, Italy, even France, had sizable leftist movements that might have been elected if free and fair elections had taken place. There's very strong evidence that we can certainly say that there was American covert disruption of those elections, and it may have been decisive. So you do have that element of Western Marxism trying to build the bridge from its end, but then you have the Polish state, the Polish nation state, which after centuries of Russian domination and with a strong traditionalist Catholic identity, refuses. You simply can't get them to go along. They consider your project to be diabolical. They consider Soviet atheism to be literally infernal. And, well, is this when you crush grapes? And if you start down that course, then you're inviting war and destruction onto millions of people's lives. And the only thing that can possibly justify it is victory and triumph, because 200 years down the road, you can remember the victims and you can try to atone for historical sins, but at least you've secured that future. If you start down that path and you fail, then you've committed great and heinous crimes which will not be forgiven, and all you've managed to do is make the world a bloodier and more dangerous place.
Right. Yeah, no, it is a very tricky situation, but at least in that moment, there was in people's minds a choice between some sort of socialist project and the current status quo society, capitalist society. Whereas now we're being asked by anti-imperialists to sign off on these wars, invasions of aggression, based on simply a kind of a negative vision. There's no victory in sight on the other side of this.
And the interwar period is also instructive about what happens when an imperialist international order unravels. Prior to World War I, the British Empire was the great world-spanning hegemon, and networks of British institutions, the Anglo-American relationship, various arrangements within Europe, stabilized the security situation and prevented large-scale conflicts from erupting in the heartland. You had colonial wars, certainly. You had atrocities in the colonies, absolutely. But there was an overarching global order that permitted things like trade, that allowed the development of countries like Japan, that mitigated the interstate element of international violence. After World War I demolishes that system, and the outbreak of World War I also shows the limitations of that system, right? You can see that the roots were already, the seeds were already planted. You have the big story is, of course, the emergence of the USSR. But if we zoom out and look at the global view, what actually takes place is not the replacement of an Anglo-imperialism with a sort of happy, successful multipolarity, but a multipolarity of imperialisms, a Japan center, a Washington center, a London center, a Berlin center, a Paris center, and the gold standard and the various monetary and economic agreements that had permitted international economic integration, trade, and investment, that those were abruptly shut off, and you had a reorientation of the colonial world into networks that were based on local imperial hegemonies. And, from the perspective of Japan, well, you were out from under the British, but from the perspective of Koreans, from the perspective of Manchurians, from the perspective of Chinese, you now had an even more ruthless imperial overlord to satisfy. And likely with this moment where perhaps American imperialism is passing, you don't even have one USSR to point to as the potential incubator of a leftist world system. Instead, I think that the most likely outcome is that the multipolarity of the interwar period, which ends with World War II, not with some rebalanced world order where greater degrees of sovereignty assure security for all players, but in an even ghastlier global conflagration than World War I. Similarly to the interwar period, if the American imperialism passes in this chaotic way, where the institutions of international exchange and political talking shops and regional institutions break down, then you don't even have a USSR. There's just going to be a Moscow-centric imperial order, a Beijing-centric imperial order. Perhaps in the Middle East, you might have Turkish or Iranian. Perhaps in Southeast Asia, it might be India. Maybe Europe would step up to run its own affairs and be able to project power into its backyard. But right, the experience of Maghrebis and Middle Easterners with French and British, well, Britain's just going to sink to the North Sea. But with European hegemony, doesn't encourage a great deal of faith in how that power might be used, absent some international conventions, some rule-based system to mitigate and control the use of force by sovereign nations, by these regional imperial systems.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this is something that came up in the Blumenthal interview, in a slightly different framework, a more general kind of frame or way of describing what you're saying. And it when I think about this, I wonder if the Cold War might be best thought of as a competition between the two imperial powers rather than ideologically. But
I think that's certainly the case.
Yeah. So when we're talking about multipolarity, we are talking about a return to a competition between imperial powers, a more of an even playing field between imperial forces, and that means, maybe not a more violent world, but certainly not a less violent world. Possibly a more violent world. Possibly another world war.
At best, you get the concert of Europe, which is a fundamentally conservative gentleman's agreement between great powers on how to manage security affairs on the European continent, with kinship relations between aristocratic and royal families. But seems absolutely
But we're not talking about
it right now.
Right. We're not just talking about Europe. We're talking about needing that for the whole world, right?
Yes. So it would be a much more challenging arrangement to engineer, but it would be a fundamentally conservative one, conservative multipolarity where the peak players have a tacit agreement about what you can do, what you can't do, where you can go, where you can't go, and allow some global institutions like maybe SWIFT to operate to allow mutually beneficial exchange between them.
Right. Like mobsters dividing up territory. We have an agreement. Yes. We won't go into your territory. We're not going to sell here. We're not going to put our prostitutes here.
Yes.
Don't worry. And then, eventually that breaks down and there's a war. Eventually that goes wrong.
And the Council of Europe worked for about 100 years between Napoleon and World War I, which isn't nothing. But then it ends with World War I.
And you got to remember, in that time, there was also attempts at revolution, that was not like it was a peaceful era.
And the expansion of colonialism in the Third World. I mean, the benefits, we're only talking about a European security system. For elites.
Because you had, I'm just thinking about 1848. The Communist Manifesto was written during that time period. So it's not as though there were famines. It's not as though you had a system of equality established. This was an autocratic period.
Yes. You were less likely to be mobilized to die in trench warfare, but it's not as though all of these states, which included the Russian empires as a major participant, could be described as majoritarian or interested in the common well-being.
Right.
That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is the interwar period, where it's much shorter. The much sharper competition leads to more and more virulent forms of nationalism, and it ends within a generation in just global slaughter. So multipolarity is not necessarily something to wish for without an idea of how it could be managed to damp down security risks and the possibility of general warfare. And that's, to link back with my previous point, that's a piece that's missing in the anti-imperialist approach, that if you do break down the DC-based order, the transatlantic order, then how do you prevent an interwar period from manifesting internationally? Already we're seeing signs of very aggressive forms of nationalism and reaction, not just in the United States, not just in Western countries, but also in China, also in India, also, of course, in Russia.
Yeah, and it's a very big problem. When I talked to Max Blumenthal about this, he just sort of copped to the fact that he didn't have a positive prescription. He didn't have any political agenda that was not purely critical of the United States. And the other moment that arose where I think that the limitations of the anti-imperialist position became clear was when he compared the amount of attention being given to the Ukraine invasion to the situation in Yemen.
War.
Yeah, and to me, that's not an intelligent comparison, even despite the fact that maybe on level of human suffering they're comparable, but the difference is geopolitical, and
also
the risks are different.
That's an excellent point, and I point out that the Yemen war in some ways benefited from a lack of attention because there was less anti-Houthi, anti-Iranian war fervor like we're seeing targeting Russia. Be careful what you wish for in terms of getting the gaze of the media squarely on you. And second of all, there were attempts, including by Bernie Sanders in a bipartisan bill with Republican senators, to stem the flow of arms and to reduce the level of violence in Yemen. So I realize that popular attention is a valuable currency, and that there is something meaningful behind morally mobilizing an audience behind a particular cause. But I don't necessarily see how this comparison gets us to the conclusion that it really is just Washington, D.C. centric. There's no limits on what imperialism can do. That's the real enemy. It more seems as though you have two very serious, tragic conflicts with nuances and dynamics of their own. In Yemen, for instance, the United States isn't even a significant instigator. The conflict is prosecuted on the anti-Houthi side by the Gulf Cooperation Council, by other regional Sunni anti-Iranian countries, and largely fought by either their national military, Yemeni Sunni Yemeni sympathizers, and lots of mercenaries.
Right. I mean, it does go to show, though, that under the imperial order, the unipolar imperial order, the level of violence, there's always violence going on. There's everyday violence going on. There's the level of conflict is unacceptably high. The death toll is unacceptably high. The inhumanity is unacceptable. And you can see the last 30, 40 years has just been, not just when you count the U.S. aggression itself, but you look at the whole total picture. It's a Wild West.
It's dismal.
Yeah, it is dismal. And but when I feel as though when we are facing a situation which could literally blow up the world again, when that comes back into the picture, especially when it's been, when the historical justification for that has gone away, when we're 30 years away from the moment where there was a true potential for disarmament and a new system of shared power. When you come back to the moment where like movies like War Games and The Day After suddenly seem relevant again, it does. I think it's incumbent upon people on the far left, particularly Marxists perhaps, but people on the far left in general, to think again, like to notice that what's gone on, to notice how their own politics don't transcend the reality of even the unipolar world. Like, by taking an anti-imperialist line like the one we've been describing, you're still very much caught up in the kinds of thinking, the framework that has created these conditions, I think. Not that thinking alone is going to get us beyond it, but it seems like at least something we could start with. To go back to the Atlantic Council and the vision of a rule-based system and the UN and all these rule of law and all that malarkey. I think I asked what it was that undermined those attempts, and what would you think would be necessary to start again down a road where that kind of system of order might have enough popular support behind it and be enough of there be enough political force behind insisting upon that kind of thing to get it off the ground? Was it? I mean, I know that the right wing hates the UN and hates this idea of international agreements and
globalists
and globalism. But I don't believe that was the primary impediment to creating that kind of system of power. But I don't know. What do you think?
So, to introduce a rule-based international order, as opposed to simple power differentials determining the place of different countries and hierarchies, and having ad hoc, emails, tweets from Washington to tell you what to do. Mm-hmm. You need the hegemonic power to invest in those rules and those institutions, and apply and be willing to, at least on occasion, accept that its first preference may be ruled out because of the rules and structures and procedures of the order. Mm-hmm. The whole point and the source of the legitimacy of the rules for other countries is that the hegemon doesn't always get their way. But even for the hegemon, there are significant countervailing benefits. One is you spend less on defense because there's fewer potential conflict points. There's dispute resolution mechanisms that prevent any particular conflict from escalating into a security threat. Mm-hmm. You get the benefits of international trade. You have access to other countries and other societies, research, technology, information, as well as resources. You have access to new markets, and you exercise your power and set the agenda in a way which doesn't instinctively generate resistance as a first reaction. Also, it's easier to isolate rule breakers because it's clear that a particular violation, for instance, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, which I believe, we could place it at the tail end of the Cold War era multilateral order.
Mm-hmm.
It was clear that Iraq broke a fundamental rule that it had accepted, that it had agreed to.
Mm-hmm.
A multilateral agency with representation from 4 other great powers other than the United States adjudicated and determined that the rules had been broken, and then there was a sanction to use violence in order to bring Iraq into conformity with the international rules.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not defending the conduct of the war, and I wish that it had never happened. However, this was a intervention that didn't escalate out of control and that didn't lead to large-scale regional or global destabilization. It was the system working as it should.
I want to stop there for a moment and underline that. Is like, to me, that is not a ringing endorsement for this vision, right? I mean, because I was opposed to the intervention after Kuwait, the attack.
2003.
No, in
Desert Storm.
Desert Storm, the Gulf War. That's what you're referring to, right? Kuwait.
Yes, that's what I'm referring to.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I was opposed to that. Yeah, I was out in the street against it. I thought it was a crime and not a war, and it was unnecessary. And the fact that the UN, that George Herbert Walker Bush got the full support of the United Nations, and it was all by the book and legal, it didn't impress me at the time. And now I'm older and wiser, but it seems to me that there are many avenues for a peaceful resolution that were not taken at the time. That maybe that it also seemed to me that because it was taking place as the Cold War was wrapping up, that it was happening so that the United States could continue to exert power. It was a way for the United States to signal that it was not done with the Cold War, that it was going to continue to use its military to influence events. And, I would go so far, and like a conspiracy theorist, maybe, to say, we did, in fact, at least accidentally, maybe, give Saddam and Iraq the green light on invading Kuwait, saying that we're not going to be involved in, I think, and we will not react against him if he does that. So go ahead. You can respond.
I want to respond to that, and then I think we can pivot to
Ukraine.
Well, I was going to try to get into the black box of how Washington and the military-industrial complex works, and
okay. But respond first, and then pivot. Yeah.
So, part of me wants to say, well, are Kuwaitis the grapes to be crushed for Saddam's vision of Iraqi greatness or pan-Arabism? Because this was a sovereign country that was stormed by aggressive forces. Its people were killed, and its sovereignty and independence completely dissolved. It is a classic violation of the fundamentals of the UN Charter. And it is possible that you could have, by taking more time, brokered some kind of deal with Saddam Hussein and reestablished Kuwaiti independence without Operation Desert Storm. I don't know how you would do that. certainly the giant buildup of U.S. and coalition forces in the region was a very clear signal that if Saddam wanted to prevent war, well, he better start talking quickly. And the UN resolution condemning him also provides Iraq, which has a representative at the United Nations, which is a member of the United Nations, a venue to discuss, debate, and try to resolve the crisis that got it condemned. Iraq didn't take those steps, and some onus needs to fall on the Iraqis as the instigators of an aggressive invasion of a smaller neighbor, just like Russia needs to reckon with the fact that it was the instigator. Its tanks are surrounding Kiev. It's not Ukrainian tanks surrounding Moscow. And and for me, with the understanding that in the world as it is structured and as it is organized, you're often picking from just terrible, suboptimal outcomes. That the realm of possible responses is constrained, and all of them are different shades of gross. But the Desert Storm gross is much better than the 2003 invasion gross or the Kosovo gross.
Yeah. Okay, and I'll just say my memory is that now this may be wrong, okay, but this is I wanted to verify it, but I couldn't Google fast enough. My memory is that before U.S. forces were deployed in response, there was an agreement. Saddam basically agreed to withdraw, but did not accept all the terms of that withdrawal. So there was an addendum of demilitarization along with withdrawal. So leave your weapons behind, demilitarize, and get out. And that was not acceptable to Saddam, and because of that, I mean, my memory is that we were shooting soldiers who were retreating in the back.
There's the highway of death. Colin Powell, I believe, at the time, operationally authorized the destruction of non-threatening retreating forces of the Iraqi military.
Right.
Then again, there were also thousands of Iraqis that surrendered immediately and peacefully and were well treated. I'm not presenting this as a model perfect in every way, merely a less odious form of imperfection.
Though, look, I appreciate it because, it's warts and all here. This is warts and all what we're talking about. So why don't you pivot into how the military-industrial complex works and how Washington works, I guess, is what you were going to describe.
Yes. So the Imperial Metropole, right? The conduct of imperialism is also one area where anti-imperialists, I'd argue, have something of a blind spot. First of all, there's a conflation of the West, NATO, and the United States into a single block, as though there weren't internal disagreements and alternate views, alternate priorities among the different national actors. Even going just to the level of DC, the military-industrial complex, the security services, the State Department, congressional leaders, presidents, generals, they get lumped into a single imperial machine. And from the outside, where you just see the outcome of decisions made within Washington, it can seem as though it's a structure which has that disciplined command and control, that it knows what it wants and it is going out and doing it. However, the American political order, like any political order, has alternate nodes of power, different procedures, different interests of different agencies, and also of individuals within those agencies, limitations on the flow of information, and different types of blind spots, often ideological, but they could also be personal, or they might stem from decisions made in the past that undermine intelligence gathering and analysis. For instance, the run-up to the 2003 war in Iraq, and the Iraq war is taken as an example of the imperial apparatus working towards its ends. But it coincided with a great deal of internal opposition from members in good standing, leaders even of the military-industrial complex. Most famous is perhaps General Erich Shinseki, who deliberately, knowingly undermined the Rumsfeld-Cheney war case by insisting that an order of magnitude more, or several times more, troops would be necessary for stabilization operations than had been included in the invasion plans drawn up by the neoconservative wing of the defense establishment. You also had the exodus of a very large number of analysts at the CIA and the State Department that were and the Department of Defense that were specializing in the Middle East. An entire generation of Arabists just went out the door because all of their guidance and assessment concerning how to manage a post-conflict Iraq had been completely disregarded by the national leadership. And there were, because of Desert Storm and the experience that many members of the military and many civilians in the Department of Defense or in other agencies had with the reality of occupying or liberating or reorganizing in a post-conflict situation a Middle Eastern country, some parts of Iraq even, people who had dealt with the Kurds, people who had organized the no-fly zones, for instance, people who had betrayed the Shia as well. There was a great deal of experience, and there was a clear motivation for developing plans for how to do it right, how to ensure that an occupation of Iraq wouldn't become a multi-sided bloodbath with sectarian militias murdering civilians on an epic scale. And you had shelves and shelves of documents about things like, how do we keep the postal system running? How do we run traffic in Baghdad? How do we make sure that the sewers work? What do we do with the police? All of these very basic questions, but essential ones when you have a change in political order and ones with grave consequences for the Iraqi population. Those were all shelved. Those were all completely disregarded. And instead, the neoconservative wing of the defense establishment used its position in the Bush administration to commission a new set of reports, many after the invasion had already started, many after the occupation were already underway, to answer the same questions, but come up with answers that legitimated the small footprint, shock and awe, in and out, cheap and fast pitch that the American people received about how the war was to be conducted. So you have heterogeneity inside the security structures. Even, you don't have any leftists, which is another issue, right? One thing that I'd recommend for for young socialists that are trying to determine what their life course should be is, have you thought about the military-industrial complex? Because one, if we're not represented, then we won't even know what's happening inside it. And the only way that you get the network of personal connections and the bureaucratic experience that would allow you to potentially dismantle it in the future is if you've actually been in those offices and spoken with those people. Otherwise, they will close ranks against you and withhold information and use all the bureaucratic measures at their disposal, which are endless, to prevent you from being able to reform, reduce, or dismantle those agencies and those programs. So you, even without leftists, you have a divergence of perspectives, of policy positions, of worldviews. And in the late Cold War period, and Max Blumenthal specifically cited this, he counterposed Paul Wolfowitz as a neoconservative American unilateralist with James Baker, Brent Scowcroft, these older generation realists that were much more reserved in their willingness to deploy American force and to trammel on existing agreements. The James Baker, I believe, was the one who made the initial promise not to expand NATO beyond Germany, for instance. And George H.W. Bush himself, during the fall of the Soviet Union, gave the famous Chicken Kiev speech, where he attempted to damp down the nationalist calls for independence of the socialist republics that would lead to the destruction of the Soviet Union. He felt that from a systemic view, a much weakened and more limited, but continuous Soviet Union would be a better partner and a greater assurance of regional stability and world peace than its dissolution into a fragmented, newly independent states, many of which had no previous experience with independent and sovereign political order, at least in modern times.
Well, I have one last question for you here, and it's about that period after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think I asked Max Blumenthal this roughly, and I'll ask you now: why is it that the United States felt it was why didn't the Washington establishment help maintain either the Soviet Union in this weakened state, as you're pointing out, or at the very least try to assure that a functional state remained in place after the Soviet Union fell apart, at least in Russia, rather than turning the country over to kind of warlordism and foreign looting the way that it did.
And Max Blumenthal was absolutely correct about the Harvard boys arriving in Russia. Jeffrey Sachs, Andrei Schleifer, Fat Larry Summers, that you had these Western experts brought in to Russia.
Friedmanites, basically?
Yes, precisely. Friedmanites. Yeah. To administer shock therapy as a means of economic transformation and revival. And this was repeated on smaller scales all across the former communist countries.
Does that kind of line up with the way Clinton was transformed from maybe a New Deal Democrat into a neoliberal after he was elected, and the whole move towards welfare reform and and deregulation. That
Yes, I believe, and there are there's some great cultural artifacts from the 90s and early 2000s that illustrate what the hegemonic worldview of the PMC and the leadership class was. And it was a generational shift away from both New Deal liberalism as a domestic economic model and détente realism as and multilateralism as a global security approach. You basically, the libertarians just won completely. I recall this very clearly because as an undergraduate at Harvard from 98 to 2002, there was no left. All of the accounts about contemporary world conditions were markets, globalization, internet. And the world will take care of itself because capitalism is a system of spontaneously generated order.
Right, like an ecosystem.
Exactly. And Hayek is the, even more than Friedman, is the intellectual godfather of the system. And it didn't come out of nowhere. During the long New Deal era in Washington and in Western countries in general, the libertarian vision was preserved and cultivated by billionaires, by extremist ideological types like Ayn Rand and the objectivist movement, other figures, because it was seen as a liberatory account of human social organization, which turned all of the New Deal rostrums on their head and allowed you to justify the root and branch destruction of the New Deal, quasi-social democracy that had been established in the U.S. and the rollback of social democracy elsewhere. And it created space for billionaires. I mean, at that time, we merely called them multimillionaires, but for the very wealthy, which incidentally, when we talk about economic elites during the New Deal era, you largely mean executives at companies. You do not mean individuals of great wealth. The CEOs of Ford or AT&T were seen as the leaders of business, and they had a stakeholder approach where you look after your shareholders, sure, but you have to think about your customers and you have to think about your employees as well. Friedman is the one who dismantles that into a shareholder value absolutism, where the only thing you think about is the return on investment that you can offer the owners of the company. And that those owners from 1945 to the 1970s were in an extraordinarily frustrating position where they had great wealth, but they didn't have the freedom to use it to reorganize society however they liked. They were constrained despite having this power. Libertarianism allowed them to break out of that. And the libertarian accounts of things like the invention, the development of the commercial internet, the IT revolution, the sort of hippie capitalist
California ideology.
Exactly. Yeah. That allows the forms of pro-capitalist libertarianism to seep in to the left, or to the constituencies that had previously been allergic to capitalism, while the objective value proposition for reactionaries and figures of great wealth on the right, that by doing libertarianism, we actually are we're taking down the power of the state, which means that our power will expand to fill that void. We call it freedom, but it's actually the exchange of public control for private control. And we're the ones.
And private not meaning citizen control, but private owners, the oligarchs.
Yeah, precisely. The one reason why I'm not an anarchist is that I'm not wealthy enough to be an oligarch. So I know that I will always be ruled. And the question is, am I ruled by a state which is nominally democratic and nominally dedicated to a certain level of national cohesion, national stability, universalist in some way that includes me as a citizen? Or will I be ruled by an oligarch, a baron that can dispose of me just based on their personal whim? At best, in that system, I'd be shopping around between oligarchs, but I will still be ruled. And that is what happened to Americans in the 90s. They were promised freedom, 80s and 90s. They were promised freedom, but what they got instead was the privatization of their subjugation, which went, from governments to bosses. And it also, that moment was when the autonomy of the American state, the bureaucratic institutions that actually do things and that under the New Deal had some measure of independent authority, was fundamentally undermined. And instead, all of these institutions were available for capture and for sale. And they became completely captured. When that happens, I think domestically in the United States, the possibility of multilateralism internationally is over, because the multilateral perspective, even from the self-interested view of, James Baker or Metternich and during the Concert of Europe, requires longer time horizons and a greater vision of national strength and national interest. But the the shareholder value ideology and the libertarian impulses of American society, and again, completely hegemonic among the educated elite during the 80s and 90s, meant that time horizons were extremely short, and your responsibility wasn't to create public good or to look after a public interest. It was to give people the opportunity to pursue what they considered to be their interests. And this is where you go from people saying, I believe that everyone should have healthcare, to I believe everyone should have the opportunity to have healthcare. And that language, extraordinarily toxic, because it abdicates any responsibility on the part of the government for achieving outcomes. And it also plays into a kind of learned helplessness that we saw most of all in Obama, where he has all three branches of government under his control. He has unprecedented popularity, historical opportunity to make changes. He has Wall Street on its knees because of the 2008 financial crisis. What does he do? Well, we don't have a supermajority. There's one senator that doesn't like me enough. I guess we can't do anything ever. Yeah.
He helps Wall Street stand up again, it was
close on everybody else.
Yeah, it was an amazing moment, but I didn't expect anything different from him. But it was, again, because it was a continuity of the Clinton years under Obama. It was a continuity of that same neoliberal approach, even in a moment where the economic crisis should have redirected the politics, but somehow we weren't able to make that change. And I want to go ahead.
Well, I mean, that's a whole other discussion. Right. But I'd say it's the combination of the cognitive capture by this libertarian Hayekian worldview, together with the actual bureaucratic capture of the institutions and apparatus of government.
Yeah, it's just, I just remember Alan Greenspan, a Randian, standing up in front of Congress and saying, I had an ideological blind spot. I didn't see this was going to happen. My ideology was wrong, and around the economic crisis. You would just think that maybe people would have taken that seriously. But if Greenspan can say it, why can't the Democratic president?
It's interesting because you go from Greenspan as a economic conductor who is obviously ideologically motivated. I believe that he and Ayn Rand were personally involved.
They were fucking each other. I mean, yeah.
It's more professional to say personally involved. But yes, that is what I was getting at.
Yeah. Mm.
He had this kind of intellectual gravitas behind his neoliberal absolutism.
Mm.
But when the crisis happens, Tim Geithner is the bag man, and that man obviously has very few ideological constraints or motivations, but he knows exactly how the bureaucracy works to make sure that the interests of his actual bosses are looked after during this critical period. And you go from the ideological superstructure down to the concrete policy to save all of these peak financial institutions and to reorder an already neoliberal economy into an even more aggressively unequal and hierarchical one. In a lot of ways, this is exactly what the West needs to learn, what the left needs to learn, right? Like, how do you not only be Alan Greenspan with your anti-imperialism or your economic programs, but also how to be Tim Geithner and how to make those things happen.
I've noticed that I'm not sure if it was only in conversations with you or in other conversations as well. I think there was a conversation I had the other day where the same thing happened, where the West and the left get conflated in a moment. And that's sort of a dangerous thing, not just from the point of view of a post-colonialist, but also just from the point of view of like a straight-ahead Marxist, because the left exists in China, it exists in Russia, it exists in Ukraine, it exists all around the world at this point, I think.
And sometimes is much more effective.
That it is in the West. But nonetheless, I think the reason the conflation happens is because some of these values that we're actually trying to hold on to, the ideology, which can be expressed in a kind of lukewarm way through this multilateralist vision, but which I think might go beyond that, are Western. They kind of have this Western origin. They certainly are and it's also the rhetoric or the propaganda of the West.
It's what the Atlantic Council and NATO and the U.S. State Department says they're doing. Right. So it does have this association with the West, which for some people discredits the program. But I'm going to say that it's probably my bad Slavic brain. I grew up speaking Polish at home and left West.
Okay. Okay. Fair enough. All right. Let's end it there.
So stop oppressing me.
Okay.
With your Anglophone privilege.
Okay. Fair enough. All right. I'll end it there.